It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Keith Holyoak. He's joining us from UCLA, where he runs the Reasoning Laboratory. And he has made many contributions to cognitive psychology, which are too numerous to list, but I can let you know that he was also elected a fellow of the AAAS. He has published over 170 articles and several books. His work combines behavioral and neural studies with computational modeling, so he's ideal for today's session. And his most recent book is the Cambridge Handbook of Thinking and Reasoning, which unfortunately I don't think is a how-to. He has deep interests in analogies, which we're going to hear about today, and this has actually led to his moonlighting as a poet. His talk is titled, differently than it was on the poster, Analogy, Comparative Intelligence, and Brain.
Thanks, Chris. I thought I'd throw everyone by changing my talk at the last minute and making it more broad than ever. I have a list of people who have contributed to a lot of the work that I've been talking about along the way. Because this is Brain Day, I'm sort of going to head towards the brain and hopefully get there in the later part of the talk. In the broader sense, it's all about the brain, but I'm going to be talking about behavioral approaches, some on comparative cognition now, and then sort of what makes human high-level reasoning special, and what do we know about at least the beginnings of how the brain might implement that. I'm on this sort of long list. I might single out for today's purposes Barbara Knowlton, who's my main collaborator on neuropsychology projects, also on recent fMRI, along with Ty Cannon and Russ Poldrack, are also faculty at UCLA. Derek Penn and Danny Pavanelli are comparative primatologists who I've been collaborating with, sort of some theoretical work that I'll talk about in the beginning. And I added Paul Thagard, of course, because he's here. The work I'm talking about is kind of the last decade, but it still reflects the impetus that from working with Paul back from, the early 80s. I think our last official publication was 1997, but we went through a couple of books together, including one called Mental Leaps, Analogy and Creative Thought, which I'll actually become sort of still my starting point. So what I want to do then is talk about, first of all, what's special about human intelligence. And of course it's going to turn out that something like analogical reasoning is special about human intelligence. And then address sort of what we know about how it works in humans, how it develops over childhood, how it changes in aging, and then as we start to tease apart the component processes that are used for analogical reasoning, how might those in fact be realized in the brain? Let's see. This slide does come directly from my work with Paul on the Mental Leaps book. Essentially, it was a compendium of what we informally called analogy's greatest hits. Sort of go from the Romans inventing the wave theory of sound by analogy to water waves, to Darwin's invention of natural selection, in part by analogy, to animal husbandry, and then Turing's probably still controversial analogy between the mind and a computer, which has had a lot to do, of course, with modern computer science. I always like this quote at the top from Stephen Jay Gould: "If genius has any common denominator, I would propose breadth of interest and the ability to construct fruitful analogies between fields." Basically, you know a lot about different things, and you can see new ways in which they might be brought together. That seems to be what analogy is all about. All my automatic devices are failing me. Let me see if I can get a little closer. So jumping down from the sublime of scientific history to sort of the humbler examples, which those of you who have taken SATs and GREs and Miller analogies will recognize, little A is to B is C is to D analogies have had a lot to do with psychometric analysis, and in fact it's kind of a standard way to measure individual differences in what roughly we think of as intelligence. So we have geometric analogies where the relations are changing and from A to B as C is to D. Verbal ones like play is to game, as give is to a party. In fact, it's been well known that if you look at actual measures of individual differences in something like intelligence, Spearman and Cattell, and who did sort of early work in this, distinguished fluid intelligence from more specific kind and argued that there's a kind of general or G factor, which is basically the shared variance among different IQ tests. So in this sort of a famous kind of rendering of the relationship among various kinds of ability tests, it's focused on the Raven's progressive matrix test, which many of you probably know, and I'm going to mention again later, a close cousin to psychometric analogy tests. And this is basically a multidimensional, two-dimensional representation of the shared variance among these tests. And what we've got here in this kind of inner circle are tests like geometric analogies, verbal analogies, number analogies, letter series progressions, which are also highly relational in the same kind of way, all very intercorrelated. Now, to understand sort of what's special about human intelligence, one obvious and very important way is actually to look at how human intelligence relates to that of the other species on the planet. So I actually want to take the first few minutes of the talk to kind of look at what do we know about potential precursors to analogical reasoning in other animals. Paul will recognize that this is some relationship to a chapter in our Mental Leafs book called The Analogical Ape. So I should warn him that it's basically this is my official retraction of our claims that we made a decade or so ago. So we go back to Charles Darwin, where we always go back. One of his famous quotes is that there's no doubt the ability between the ability of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. But nevertheless, those differences are basically of degree rather than of kind. So in actually a forthcoming paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which has actually not appeared yet, Derek Penn and Danny Pabanelli, the primatologists I've been working with, and argue that at least part of that quote is Darwin's mistake. We picked a nice controversial title to evoke lots of critical commentary, and we succeeded at least in getting the critical commentary. What we've come to argue, based on actually a much wider range of evidence than I can get into today, I'm going to focus on analogy, but this is a claim that cuts across causal reasoning, theory of mind, spatial mental maps, many other areas as well, is that in fact there is something that's a deeper difference than a lot of at least current comparative psychologists have appreciated. Actually, the David Premack paper I've cited makes actually rather similar points in a shorter point. And of course, he was one of the founders of this. Now, first, we do have to acknowledge that there are striking parallels between humans and their other primate cousins. I've used versions of this slide for some time now, and I'm very pleased to say that this is one of the last. We only have a few more months, and I'll never be able to use this slide again. So the first thing, to not be misunderstood, I'm not in any way denying that there are, first of all, immense commonalities between humans and other animals. And of course, when we're studying the visual system of primates, there's lots of reasons to think there's a great deal of commonality, and that's why the research converges so much. All I want to do is single out essentially what I would consider what we often now call role-based relational reasoning, of which I would take analogy to be a major special case, and look at that. So back at the time of when Paul and I did our Mental Leafs book, in fact, we were very influenced by work from David Premack's lab from back in the early 80s, and Gillen et al., that seemed to suggest that at least one non-human on the planet had mastered analogy. And that one non-human was the famous Sarah, who was a symbol-trained chimpanzee in Premack's lab. Still lives, I believe, in Ohio and has been tested from time to time over the decades since. And one of the things that suggested she was at least on the way to analogy was performance in something called a relational match-to-sample task. So in the animal world, a standard paradigm for doing same-difference judgments is I give the animal a sample, an object, or any kind of pattern. Then I give two alternatives. One is the same, and the other is different. So, for example, I could show you an apple. Here's an apple, and here's a carrot. If I'm rewarding you for picking sameness, you go for the apple that matches. I can also reward you for picking the different one, and so on. The relational match to sample, first of all, the basic matching task can be done by organisms at least well below pigeons. That's commonplace in the animal kingdom. Relational match to sample is illustrated here with this two-object case. So now I got a pair of apples. That's the sample that you're shown first. Then the animal is shown a pair of objects, and they're either the same as each other, like the two hammers, or they're different from each other. Now, it turns out, at least up until Sarah had done this, there wasn't any evidence that other non-humans could do this. It's kind of obvious to us. But if you think about what's different between this and just basic match to sample, notice that there's nothing, this is going to be the same match, of course, there's nothing physically similar between the same match and the sample. What's similar appears to be pretty abstract. These two are the same as each other, and of course these two are as well. And you can kind of see how this looks like a variation of analogy. So you could say, well, there's A is to B, same, as C is to D, same. So it matches analogically. And it's, of course, easy to make up a story that sameness is kind of the most fundamental relation, probably. So this would be a direct precursor to analogical reasoning. So the argument that we had basically accepted, that is, Paul and I, at the time of our book, is that at least given some kind of abstract symbol training, specifically symbols for same and different, which were important parts of Sarah's repertoire, could allow at least a chimpanzee to do this. But can they? And essentially what I want to argue is that what we called the analogical ape back then might more aptly be characterized as the analog ape, doing some sophisticated things, but not actually even a baby version of analogy in the human sense. So this is what's happened kind of roughly in the last 15 or so years. It was known that chimps can pass this test with less than full-blown kind of, quote, language training, just teach them same and different. But that's not too problematic at all. More is recent work by Bonk, who shows that orangutans and at least one gorilla can also pass relational match to sample without any kind of symbol training. So can some baboons, so can dolphins, so can a parrot, Irene Pepperbird's famous Alex, which unfortunately passed on a few months ago. And then what always seems to be the reductio ad absurdum to me of claims that you're working with high-level relational reasoning is when my colleague Aaron Blaisdell showed that the pigeons can do it too. So what's going on? Well, it turns out one thing that was going on is the task kind of got changed a bit as we went through at least for some of these studies. So here's an example from Ed Wasserman's lab of what was often been done more recently. Here's the sample. It's no longer just two objects. Let's generalize it to a whole bunch of objects. They're all quite different from each other. And here's your two alternatives. So which ones do you think is, quote, the matching or same one? And I think you probably agree that these are all very different. These are all very different. Not like that. But if we think for a second, you might start to see there's something kind of a little funny here. It seems like there's another way of doing this. There's some other kind of difference that seems correlated with this kind of abstract same difference talk, which, very crudely is, I think you would say, is that this looks like a mess, and this looks like a mess too. whereas this looks real neat, which if you formalize it becomes some concept of variability, or often it's formalized as an entropy measure. So basically, whenever you have different displays, they have greater variability, hence higher entropy. And now the question is, what are the animals actually picking up on? Some abstract relation of sameness or some quantitative difference in entropy? So here's an interesting cross-species comparison that Wasserman's group did, comparing Papio, the baboon, against Homo sapien, mano a mano, or so to speak, two subjects from each of two species doing the relational same difference task. So what's being plotted here, going up, is percent of different responses. So that's if you're matching, you can match either on different or on same. Number of icons in the display, 16, the great big messy ones, down to 2, sort of the original. So for these two baboons, they're, depending whether you're reinforcing same or different, they're discriminating them very well when you've got the big, messy, high entropy difference displays. But they basically fall to chance as you bring it down to 2. The Homo sapiens, God bless us, our two representatives basically did well, although one of us sort of let down the species there a little bit at 2, but looks strikingly more successful. So that's the relational matrix sample. But as I mentioned, part of the reason when people were excited about it, certainly I was, is because it looks like you could fairly interpret it as a special case of analogical reasoning. But the other thing that Sarah had done, which was certainly more spectacular, is appear to actually solve essentially psychometric analogy problems in ape-like form. And in fact, a study by Gillen and others in '81 showed apparently that she could solve problems like this. So this is to this, as that is to that, geometric formal analogy. And also with little pictures rather than words, things like padlock to a key is like a tin can to a can opener, where the one opens the other, where of course with the pictures, as you can imagine, there's no obvious physical clues whatsoever. So these seem to be functional analogies based on cause-effect relations in the world that Sarah had apparently picked up on. But had she really? So again, the story has kind of changed. A suggestion from Sue Savage-Rumbaugh was actually followed up a few years back by Odine and Thompson, who were working with Sarah in her new home by then, with the geometric analogies. And the idea, what they wanted to see, is there any other strategy that might be slipping in here and kind of giving the appearance of analogical solutions? So here's one that Sarah would tend to get right. So the square goes to this big circle, and the answer down here is to get the little circle. So that seems good. And against this is the false foil that she rejects. But if you notice, another thing you can do is just count how many changes are there from here to here. So basically, the shape changed and the color changed. And of course, from here to here, shape change, color change. So it's the right changes, but there's 2 of them. That's the other thing. You could just count them. Whereas this foil here, relative to the C term, has only got a color change, only 1. So what would happen if you simply, same problem, change the foil? So analogically, if you stick this in, that doesn't make any analogy. It's not the consistent relational changes. But square to circle is a shape change, and there's also a size change. So in fact, the number of changes is now the same as the correct analogical alternative. And it turns out Sarah is at chance on this alternative. So kind of what we're left with is that original demonstration with the functional analogies, the key and the lock and so forth. And basically the problem is twofold. One, we don't really know what Sarah knew before she got that test. And what's becoming more and more disturbing is 3 decades are slipping by, and it's never been replicated, not with Sarah, not with any animal at all. So again, this is not to say that Sarah is not smart. I mean, counting features is no mean feat. It's a strategy. It's a fairly high-level strategy, but I would argue it simply is not what we mean by analogy in the sense of the human variety, which involves aspects like this, which Dedry Gentner and Paul and I and others have always been emphasizing, that, and now I'm calling it the analogy gap with respect to the rest of the animal kingdom. So the non-human animals, what they clearly can do is respond to perceptual similarities, statistical properties of cues like entropy, which are, of course, relations in some sense, but they're still kind of perception-based relations. They tend to be symmetrical. So, in fact, the reason I would now argue that sameness is not a good relation to work on if you're trying to look at high-level reasoning, because it's pretty close to symmetrical, and you can't distinguish the roles that go into it very cleanly. What humans can do, and what sort of the ingredients of, quote, true analogy, or our version, the kind I now would call role-based relational reasoning, the constituents of the relation play asymmetrical roles. So John may love Mary, but to his great chagrin, Mary does not love John. Those two things mean something fundamentally different. The mapped objects, when you start putting the more abstract analogies that humans can do, don't have to be perceptually similar. It's the relations don't have to be highly perceptual. Basic ones like causality or cause-effect relations provide us with important bases for mapping, and is based on structure of looking for things that are playing parallel roles despite the perceptual differences. So that's kind of the end of my comparative talk, and of course there's much more one could say about that. And again, just to address one other possible misinterpretation, we of course don't mean to say that God created us with analogy and natural evolution didn't bring about humans. That in fact what we would say is that if all the species that ever existed on this planet were here among us today, we would find immeasurable gradations, just like Darwin described. But if we mean among those species that are actually here today, many have gone extinct, and not to mention, suspiciously, many of them may have gone extinct because of Homo sapiens getting here, not liking to almost as smart competitors at work. In fact, now there's a gap that's important. Now, of course, this means that we're kind of driven to study humans in a kind of a way, in sort of a stronger way than, say, a vision scientist is driven to study humans. I mean, in fact, it's not that primate work is going to be irrelevant by any means. Of course, there's going to be important commonalities, but the focus arguably ought to be on what's actually special about the human brain, and once we start to look at the brain basis of this. So, of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, that tends to bring the focus in on the prefrontal cortex, which is basically where I'm going to be going in the talk. The most evolutionarily new and the greatest difference in terms of sheer math. And actually some recent work is suggesting that at a microscopic level there are also organizational differences which may turn out to be critically linked to what's kind of special about human intelligence. Okay, now I'm going to sort of go into kind of the algorithmic level of analogy and talk about some behavioral studies, starting to get at sort of like what are the mechanisms of analogical reasoning, and in particular the process of mapping or drawing correspondences between these two situations. So just give you an example. My goal here is to kind of pick up a couple of like major constituent processes that seem to contribute to it, and then sort of track into what we can find out ultimately about how that relates to brain organization. So let's start with simply a behavioral task. This is a little task that originally was used by Markman and Gentner, and we've used in a number of studies since. It's kind of a scene analogy task. You got little line drawings, one picture above another. What you're told as a subject is you're going to be asked, after you look at this for a few seconds, you'll be cued with one of the objects in the top figure, and you have to say what object in the bottom does that correspond to or go with. We actually often make it intentionally very vague, as don't give any real basis for the answer. Now, this is an intelligent, high-level cognitive science-y audience. So what is the answer? Let's see if anyone dares to say it's the guy on the bottom. Which, did I hear someone say tree? Yeah. Now, of course, arguably, it would be perfectly reasonable to say it's the guy on the bottom. They're kind of the same category, they're visually similar. But if you think a little bit, most people can justify that actually it's kind of like the tree. That the tree was also sort of trying to like keep the dog tied up, and also failed, and the dog is off and causing mischief in both cases. And it isn't that in some sense one answer is right and the other is wrong, but what you can say is, well, one of them is relational, and the tree one is relational. That's no longer because of any kind of perceptual similarity. It's because you're filling the same role in a parallel relationship. Now, in some work which kind of follows up from earlier work that Paul and I did on a computational system we called ACME, and of course Chris and Paul have continued versions of this. I had worked in the last decade or more with John Hummel on creating essentially what we took to be at least a neurally plausible system that would implement analogical mapping of this sort. And I'm not really going to do anything more than just give you a hint of how it works. This is a bank of what we just call semantic units, those kind of amorphous feature arrays that permeate connectionist-style models. But we've got a bunch of other units over here of a more structural sort, which kind of differentiates this kind of approach from the more standard PDP-style layered networks that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And in fact, the reason we do is we would argue that you cannot make a standard PDP network perform analogical reasoning of the human sort. In fact, another interesting implication of the comparative analysis is that standard PDP models may in fact be excellent models of lots of cognitive processes in other species, and doubtless, of course, in humans, because it's not that we're totally different. But when you come to the abstract high-level reasoning that makes humans special in at least one way, that's where those models kind of just don't make it. And the brain, therefore, must have developed something sophisticated. And furthermore, sophisticated in a way it wasn't kind of easy to evolve. It was one of the arguments is that a lot of animals do a lot of smart relational stuff, sort of moving into a local minimum, so to speak, on what you can do with a kind of more standard connections network. At some point, evolution made a different move. This is, of course, getting beyond into high speculation. So, at any rate, this little example just represents a couple of propositions based on the pictures. Basically, the dog's restraining the man in one case, and the trees doing the restraining of the dog in the other. And generally, the way the model works is that at a moment in time, what we call a subpart or subproposition, basically a role binding within one of those analogs, one we call the driver because it gets everything in motion, grabs control, becomes active, and starts to activate the semantic units. Importantly, not just of the object, but of the role itself, which also has a relational representation. So restraining has units to represent its meaning, just like dogs and trees do. And those semantic units, which you've noticed are the only direct tie over to the other analog, sort of tend to activate whatever matches best. In another moment of time, the other role grabs control, and it's going to activate corresponding stuff on the other side. And in essence, this starts to oscillate. In detail, we would be hypothesizing this is gamma band time activity, kind of the computational point of using synchrony or desynchrony is to get away from what's the well-known so-called catastrophic interference problem, so that if you've got two objects that are basically sharing semantic units, if you turn them on together, you get this kind of monstrous blur, and you've lost the identity of who's doing what to who. So by analogy to kind of like time sharing the summer cottage, so different people can rent it as long as they show up on different days in a very fast time rate, these different objects and roles are sharing their semantic units. Now, the only thing I really wanted to pull out of this for right now is sort of very macro level stuff. I haven't really explained how this actually does the analogy, but what you can kind of see, first of all, if there's going to be multiple relations involved, when the analogy gets fancier, there's going to be more working memory requirements to establish the synchrony and desynchrony necessary to represent it. And in fact, at some reasonable small number, like 4 or 5, it's going to break down under sort of standard assumptions about how fast neurons can work. Another thing is it's going to involve a lot of inhibitory control. That whatever responds best over here has to, in essence, turn off whatever rivals that overlap partly but are not the best response. There's a lot of inhibitory control in the driver. At any moment, one thing has to have control and not both of them, because if you do, things will blur, the relational structure will break down. So what you get if you sort of look sort of at a macro level, not only for this Lisa model I've described, but for a few of the others in the literature probably, is that analogy models suggest that there's, first of all, limits on working memory defined in terms of the number of roles that you can maintain actively in the same kind of reasoning session. There's going to be a lot of inhibitory control for sequencing of activity, for selection between alternative mappings, and this starts to get towards the brain, there are other reasons, based on what we know about the brain, that these kinds of things, working memory and inhibitory or interference control, depend on prefrontal cortex. So what I'm sort of moving toward is look whether an analogy does too, and if so, how. But first I want to say a little bit about the development of analogy, because actually partly because it's sort of an illustration of how these working memory and inhibitory control sort of both have identifiable effects and how they change with development. So there's been a lot of work over the years on how analogy changes over childhood. Gettner and Ratterman have basically labeled the general phenomenon of relational shift as, roughly speaking, very young children, 2 to 3-year-olds, can kind of do analogy, but they tend to focus on features rather than relations. As they grow up towards adolescence, there's a tendency to put more focus on relations. What's less clear exactly is why that is. One theory is that it's basically just accretion of knowledge, that obviously young kids don't know many relations, so if they don't know them, they're not likely going to reason with them. So that's kind of Usha Goswami, I guess, very crudely. Other positions have been that there's something, not to deny that, of course, simply learning relations is going to be important, very important, but there could be maturational, brain-related changes as well, particularly in the development of things like working memory capacity, as Graham Halford, for example, has argued, and inhibitory control, which, although hasn't, I think, as far as I know, we were the first to mention the connection with analogy, but it seems to directly follow out of ideas that Adele Diamond and others have suggested in other kinds of tasks. So Lindsay Ritchell and Bob Morrison, both former PhDs of mine, and I did a study a couple of years back to try and tease apart these different explanations. And essentially we used the scene analogy type task of the sort I illustrated and to test these hypotheses. And these stimuli are basically inspired by the kinds of the the man with the dog kind of pictures that we looked at, except we tried to make them use relations that are going to be extremely well known to very young children, like 3 to 4-year-olds is our youngest. And in fact, we pre-tested them. So here you basically got some chasing going on. And chasing is one of the relations that, in fact, preschoolers can reliably, they know and they can identify it in these pictures as we tested them. So I'll just walk you through the examples. It's going to be a little 2x2 design. This is the simplest one. One relation, no distractor. So basically, if you ask what does that cat up there go with, the relational answer is this boy, because he's also a chaser. And there's kind of nothing else going on to make it anything more complicated than that. Here's where we simply produce a second relation, also chasing, so we don't have to change the relation, so we get 2 tokens of the same type. So now we got kind of the dog chasing the cat and the cat's chasing the mouse. Now mom's after the boy. So in terms of like what's the best relational match, it's still the same answer, but the basis is a little different and more complex now, because if you simply considered who's a chaser, well, then it could be mom. And who's being chased? Well, it could be this girl down here. You have to actually work with 2 relations at once to figure out that what's unique is the cat and the boy are both chasers and they're being chased. So you have this kind of the pivot in a kind of transitive chain. So that's arguably going to put greater burden on working memory. Now, if we cast an eye on this innocent-looking sandbox, which I'm sure would have been subject to change blindness if we'd done one of those experiments right here. Suppose we make a version where that's actually a passive cat. Now, of course, we've created a kind of a featural foil that didn't exist in the other versions. So now the relational answer has to avoid that featural one. So in fact, we had a little 2x2, 1 over 2 relations, and either there's a featural distractor or not. We did a pretest, which was basically to show that the kids understood our relations. Had 3 age groups, preschoolers of 3 to 4, 6 to 7-year-olds, and 13 to 14-year-olds, kind of sort of developmental milestones, as is pretty well known. And here's basically what happened when you look at the developmental trends. So this is our 4 basic conditions. These are the young preschoolers, the early school age, and the young adolescents. So this is the simple condition. 1 relation, no distractor. And you can see by any reasonable measure of chance performance, even the youngest children are well above chance. But of course, you can also see that there's an age trend, that there's something is getting better with development. Now, if we compare it to the 2 relation, no distractor, so we've just upped the working memory load, so to speak, in terms of handling roles, the oldest kids basically are not affected, but the youngest and the middle group have come down. So the younger group seems less able to handle multiple tokens of the same relation, even though it's a familiar relation that we can pretty much are assured that they do understand, and in fact, they could handle it in some cases if it was the only token out there. Here's what happens when we have only 1 relation, but we add that featural distractor, the other cat, so to speak. Again, makes a big negative impact on the younger population, but not the older one, and the same is true when you mix it, which seems to kind of saturate. Another kind of interesting way of looking at this is the errors, if you call them errors, that kids make when they don't give the primary relational response. So one kind of error is a relational one, and that's like mapping something to another object that plays the same one of your same roles, like chaser, but not the other one. So it would be like mapping that middle term to the first chaser in the series instead of the middle chaser. And of course, that can only happen when, well, no, it can always happen whenever you got in any condition. What you see, of course, is that, again, you see the oldest group isn't making errors hardly at all, but the younger groups make a lot more relational errors when you've got a second relation there to add further confusion. If you compare two relations and add a distractor, actually the relational errors go down, which might initially seem surprising until you consider that, of course, what's possible when you add a distractor is a different kind of error altogether. Forget the relations, you just go for the featural distractor, and that's, of course, exactly what the youngest kids are very tempted to do, and in fact contributes the most to their performance decrements. So what do we have here? Just in broad terms, analogical ability certainly improves. Even when you, in essence, control for knowledge by using very simple relations, you see changes that seem to reflect both an increase in coping with relational complexity, multiple relations working together, and also handling distraction or interference. In other studies, which I won't talk about, that Indre Viscontis and Barbara Knowlton and I did with aging, I regret to inform you that as is too crudely typical of as we age, it all kind of just unwinds backwards, so that the older person can handle a smaller number of relations, but don't put too many together, and don't put a bunch of featural distraction around, because that makes it even worse. So that brings us finally kind of to the brain, or at least about as close to the brain as I'm going to be talking about in the time remaining. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on prefrontal cortex. So we've kind of, at this point, sort of set up relational complexity, interference control, sort of two major components of an analogy, and want to see, can we actually relate that to frontal cortex? So the developmental and aging studies, of course, are consistent with that, because as we know, the prefrontal cortex is the slowest to mature. It's still changing up to around adolescence. We also know that it selectively tends to degenerate physically with aging, even normal aging, which, of course, is, again, consistent with the downward trend in later life. And now, if you look more closely at the sort of functional anatomical correlations within the frontal cortex, these will become more important later on when I talk about a fMRI study. Some of you probably know this. This is roughly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the lateral side, roughly anatomically where the medial frontal gyrus is, tends to be associated with working memory tasks of all sorts, NBACs, anything that requires manipulation of some sort. The ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, among other things, is involved in any kind of selection and inhibitory control, probably. So, for example, things like Stroop interference, stop signal in a motor control. In reasoning, Bennett Goel, I think, has got evidence that belief bias in deductive reasoning, when you got to reason abstractly, even though the stuff you're reasoning about disagree with the conclusion you're supposed to reason to, all of that engages this kind of selection area, which, of course, includes what's classically called Broca's areas. But now there's a lot of suggestions that, in fact, a lot of what's special about it is not language, it's just that language requires a lot of selection. And then there's this anterior, sometimes called rostrolateral area, which is seeming to emerge as if there's any one area that somehow has a special role in this high-level relational integration, it suggests that that is. Not, of course, that it's the only area, so the whole brain is active. It's not just the prefrontal cortex, and all these areas, as you'll see, are engaged. But it seems like it may be special for the integration component that I'll be mentioning. So I want to start by just going over a fairly old neuropsychology experiment, which I still think is kind of like the best sort of between your eyeballs demonstration of the importance of having a prefrontal cortex if you're going to be a relational reasoner. And in fact, a human prefrontal cortex, I would now add. This is work that I did with Jim Waltz and Barbara Knowlton, with Bruce Miller, our neurologist, now at UC San Francisco, working with a population having what's called frontal temporal dementia or frontal temporal lobar degeneration. A very sad dementia of aging, not to be confused with Alzheimer's, although it can present with similar symptoms. Some ways it's worse. It has an earlier age of onset. It can be in the 50s, often 60s. As the name implies, it involves degeneration of the frontal and temporal lobes. There's no treatment, and it's inevitably fatal. So it's a very, very sad disease. For our purposes, it turns out that in the early phases of this disease, there are often two kind of subvariants, which very crudely are the people who start losing the frontal cortex, and then by and by they're going to lose the temporal, and those who go in the other direction, which if you catch them at the right few months, is kind of a pretty good model of what happens if you have a very large bilateral damage to that cortex. And you can ask, well, what can they do and what can they not do? And you have two pretty good control groups. So they have the same degree, disease, and matched in relevant ways. So this is what's called a SPECT scan. It's a 3D rendering showing the degree of blood perfusion. So if your brain is working, you got lots of blood going along, and it's all filled in. That's a normal subject. This is one from a frontal variant. Looks like they got a hole in where their frontal cortex is. Of course, that's not physically true. What is true is the blood's not flowing there because it's not working in a normal way. And these kind of people, as you probably know, have personality changes and what's broadly called dysexecutive changes. This is a temporal variant where the temporal poles are disappearing, but notice the frontal cortex is preserved. These people actually primarily have what we would call semantic memory deficits. These are not like HM. They haven't lost their episodic memory. The hippocampus is largely intact. Actually, they're often studied in their own right under the heading of semantic dementia. Some of you probably know work by Graham and Hodges in England on that. And basically, they, for example, can't do picture naming. They have lots of trouble with word finding. Rather sadly, these people, of course, have preserved emotional responses and realize something terrible is going on. The frontal variant sometimes is in some ways a little better because they sort of don't care as frontal patients kind of lose their affect and goals and so forth. So our approach in this study was basically to see what happens when we go through reasoning tasks. And for reasons related to what I've already been talking about, we thought that what you really need your prefrontal cortex is to reason when you've got to put multiple relations together and figure out what they jointly imply. So when relational complexity gets higher than one, you've got to take two relations, like the two-relation version of the kid analogy task. So in this case, patient characteristics, mid-60s, college-educated. For the patient's IQ, just slightly below normal, although remember, college-educated, obviously there's been a decline from normal functioning. This is called the mini mental status exam, bedside sort of IQ-ish test. All of us would hopefully get 30 out of 30. These people are definitely impaired, but they're still functioning. It's not catastrophic. Small numbers, half a dozen each, rare, which is probably just as well, but for research purposes means each of these studies takes a couple of years before the patients show up. So first of all, just to show you that it's not that your frontal patients are always bad, here's a couple of standard tests. Boston Naming is naming some simple pictures. The prefrontal group is doing quite well. The temporal group is way down because that's semantic memory. Likewise, the WASAR information subtest is basically a general knowledge subtest. The frontal group is doing better than the temporals. So that's just to kind of set up that frontals aren't just universally doing worse. So what we worked with here was a version of, very simple version of the Raven's matrix task that we made up, which is nice, as you'll see, because you can vary the number of relations that are relevant extremely systematically. Now here, you'll see the simplest Raven's test that there ever will be. Their task is, given those figures, what do you think is the best completion in there out of all of these alternatives? And I think most of you probably got the answer. And we would call this a zero relation test because it's sort of like just perceptual completion, no real thinking required. One notch up, here's a test where you're flipping upside down on the vertical dimension, but there's no change horizontally. So if you take this guy and flip upside down, you would, this guy and flip upside down, or this one and be the same, you'll pick up the one that fits in. So one relation is required, but not the integration of two. And then finally, the sort of the killer. So here's one where horizontally you take a bite out, and vertically you change the surface pattern, put those two changes together, and it defines the best answer. But notice, among other things, this is the first of these series where the answer is not physically identical to anything that you saw in the original problem. Now, presumably, this is still trivial. I mean, we can push this way up as we would do with a normal college population, but this was enough for the frontal study. So here's the results. 0, 1, 2 complexity level. Normals in green, temporals in yellow. Essentially perfect all the way through. Most strikingly, the frontals start out okay, hang in there pretty fine for 1, and fall to what by a reasonable measure is actually chance when you have to combine two relations. And we did the same thing with a transitive inference task, so it's not just this one. But I think this is kind of a striking demonstration that if you basically don't have a human prefrontal cortex, the thing you've really, really lost is taking two relations, putting them together, and figuring out what they jointly imply. Well, I can see I've running out of time quickly. So give me another 5 minutes or so, okay? I'll just very briefly flip through another follow-up study with the frontal temporal patients, which gets at the other major dimension of concern, interference control or inhibition. Also, arguably a likely function of prefrontal cortex. So we did a study, this is Bob Morrison in our group, on verbal analogies of the sort we illustrated right up front. And I'll just show you what they look like. They're very simple ones. So lake is to ocean as big as 2. We define something called semantic facilitation index, which is simply the difference between a rating with independent subjects of how similar is the C term, just by general semantic association, to the analogical answer, which is starred, and the FOIL. And big to bigger, big to small, about equal, actually. So we call that neutral, because the SFI measure will be close to 0. You can also have a positive SFI. Motorist to engine is middle is 2. The answer is center. Middle and center are fairly highly related. Middle to end, less so. So you don't even have to think analogically on this one. You just go with the general association and you're okay. And then the nasty one is play is the game as give is to, and the relational answer is party. However, if you do ratings, give party is less related than give take, because antonyms tend to go high. So here you actually you have an interference or inhibitory control problem. You got to not only calculate the relational answer, you got to stop yourself from giving the closer related FOIL. And basically what you find, controls are fine, temporals are terrible. Remember, now it's semantic analogies, and they don't know what the words mean, basically, anymore. The frontals go down, are fine, well, not fine, but okay for positive. Clearly, they show the most interference selectively for the SFI group. And I'm going to skip through a second example of same general thing, interference in the frontals, and just conclude that we've got evidence for sort of both these mechanisms are impaired in frontal patients when you have to integrate relations or when you have to control interference. So what I want to end with is a functional imaging study where we're trying to sort of carry this into a more fine-grained analysis with normal brains. Because the downside of the FTD population is you get this massive brain damage. You can't really say anything about localizations and whether these mechanisms are really the same or different. Because I've talked about working memory and inhibition as if they're different, and a lot of people would, but you could argue, for example, that if just your inhibition was gone, even in the Lisa model that I showed you, it would all fall apart, and that's the end of this. It's all inhibition. And you could argue, on the other hand, that it's all how much working memory you've got, and inhibitory control would sort of just be a side effect of it. But if we can find some kind of dissociation in brain areas that are responsive to these different sources of difficulty, we could say something about their relationship more precisely. So there's been a lot of studies of ravens and simple A is to B, C is to D analogies. These are the studies that have tended to show that anterior rostrolateral response, including, let's see, Kalina Christoph was one of the early ones who actually we worked with, and Jim Kroger was my student who did a similar study at UCLA. But what actually nobody, as far as I know, up to this study I'll tell you about, has done is kind of put two different sources of difficulty, one of them being the inhibitory control problem, together into the same kind of problem and see where in the brain the different sources of difficulty cause a response. So what we used is a kind of funny little A is to B, C is to D analogy problem that we call people pieces, which has a somewhat odd history. It's modified from Bob Sternberg back in 1977. And as a sort of historical oddity, Bob and I were both graduate students together with Gordon Bauer in offices next to each other, and I sort of knew all about his original study. And for those who know my later work on analogical problem solving, one of the things that really guided our work is to do something completely different from this boring people piece stuff that Bob Sternberg did. But after waiting 30 years, I realized that on second thought, those stimuli have a very interesting purpose because you can vary systematically how many dimensions you've got to attend to and also how many you need to ignore. So here's how it works. So there's always 4 dimensions. For some odd reason, these people have no arms, which is also special. But I actually think Bob stole these from somebody in the 1950s. So these are really antiquated stimuli. But so basically, you can have, say, the color is binary, gender is binary, height, and girth. So what we do is we give you a problem, and basically we highlight on a single problem. All you got to do is attend to, for example, gender. The rest doesn't matter. That's kind of how it works. And then you make the analogical response based on that one or whatever number of dimensions. So the good thing, I'm going to go a little faster here to illustrate this. So here's a couple of problems. In this case, color is relevant. You're supposed to attend to it and ignore the others. Now, it turns out, actually, if you, for example, attended to height accidentally, wouldn't matter. Same. So there's no real interference, but there's one thing you got to attend to, gender, or color. Over here, relational complexity 3, you got to attend to color, height, and width, and ignore just one. So we got a big manipulation of what I would call relational complexity, now instantiated in how many dimensions are relevant. The good thing, unlike, say, the Ravens problem, is that visually, those two problems are about equal in complexity, because a bugaboo of Ravens is, as you make it, add more stuff going on, it's just visually more complicated. But that's not true for this. The other thing we can do is to start to add interference, illustrated by here. So here, you're supposed to just attend to width. Now, if you accidentally attended to height, no problem. However, if you accidentally attended to color, different, same, it would suggest a mismatch when the correct answer is match. So that's interference. So essentially, we got a little 2x2. Relational complexity was kind of the big whopper, either 1 or 3 dimensions. Interference, either 0 or 1, irrelevant and actively misleading dimension. For reasons of encoding. One thing is actually an important methodological detail. You get the AB, you still get the AB, and after a delay, you get told which is relevant. So we delay the queuing. And intermixed are some trials where the AB term actually disappears. Basically, we're forcing the subjects to actually encode the physical stuff so that, in fact, they have something to interfere with them later on if it, in fact, goes away. But all our analyses are done on just matched trials when the AB stays on. So there's no actual memory load in an obvious sense. Behaviorally, monstrous effect of relational complexity, like seconds extra. Harder to see, but significant is actually an interaction. When relational complexity is high, you also get an interference effect, which is actually like 100 and some odd milliseconds, not as trivial as it looks when you put them together. There's accuracy main effects of both factors. So there's some behavioral signs of both factors. Now, what we were predicting based on sort of looking at the literature was, first of all, that anterior region should be sensitive specifically to relational integration. This is the frontal pole, Brodmann's area 10, rostral laterals, or various names for roughly the same thing. Then there's the inferior middle frontal gyrus, which also, and particularly the inferior frontal gyrus or ventrolateral area is what we'd especially expect to play a role in interference control. Although there's lots of reasons to think it might also be important for manipulating relations, because you got to, for example, in the Lisa model, you have to sequence which relation are you activating each second. So first of all, just to jump quickly to results, notice these are always subtractions within the task. So all the brain's active, but this is what's more active when you have the high level of relational complexity. And notably, it includes the frontal pole areas. And in fact, if you compare this to an earlier study by Kalina Christoph with the Ravens task, actually pretty good agreement for kind of a very high-level reasoning task. And again, this is a subtraction of relational complexity levels. Then we did a small volume correction to look at regions of interest, particularly for the interference effect, which was more subtle, and we mapped that on to the relational complexity effect. So areas in red are selectively activated just by relational complexity, yellow just by interference, and blue overlap, where actually both manipulations activated. And in essence, relational complexity only activates the very anterior rostrolateral areas. Again, suggesting that it is somehow special for the complexity manipulation itself. You get overlap, particularly in both medial and particularly inferior frontal gyrus, or very close to its border. And interference itself is basically in the IFG. So, what do we know? These component processes undergo cognitive development. They also undergo deterioration and aging, or even more seriously with frontal damage. We're starting to be able to associate specific component processes with specific subareas of prefrontal cortex. And out of this, and undoubtedly a much, much more complicated story, results in sort of what's unique about human intelligence. Thank you.